The morning of July 1, 1916, dawned quietly over the rolling farmland of northern France. A light mist clung to the fields and hedgerows along the River Somme, softening the outlines of villages and woods that had already been scarred by 2 years of war. To a distant observer, the scene might have seemed peaceful, almost pastoral. But beneath that calm surface, more than 100,000 men waited in silence, standing shoulder to shoulder in narrow trenches carved into the chalky earth. Within hours, many of them would be dead or wounded. By the end of the day, it would become the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army. And by the time the battle finally ended months later, the combined casualties on all sides would approach 1 million men. This was the Battle of the Somme, one of the defining tragedies of the First World War. To understand how such devastation became possible, it is necessary to step back from that quiet morning and look at the larger war that had already consumed Europe. The First World War began in the summer of 1914, triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo. What followed was a rapid chain reaction of alliances, mobilizations, and declarations of war that drew the great powers of Europe into a conflict they believed would be short and decisive. Instead, by the end of 1914, the war on the Western Front had settled into a brutal stalemate. After the German advance through Belgium was halted at the First Battle of the Marne in September 1914, both sides attempted to outflank each other in a series of maneuvers known as the Race to the Sea. When those efforts failed, the opposing armies dug in. From the English Channel to the Swiss border, nearly 500 miles of trenches stretched across France and Belgium. These trenches became the defining feature of the Western Front. Protected by barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery, they created a battlefield where defense held a decisive advantage over attack. Throughout 1915, the Allied powers, primarily France and Britain, launched repeated offensives in an attempt to break through the German lines. Battles at places like Neuve-Chapelle, Loos, and Champagne resulted in enormous casualties but little territorial gain. The Germans, meanwhile, perfected a system of deep defensive positions, with multiple trench lines and fortified strongpoints designed to absorb and repel attacks. By the beginning of 1916, the war on the Western Front had become a war of attrition, where success was measured not in miles gained, but in the enemy's ability to endure losses. In February 1916, the Germans launched a massive offensive against the French at Verdun. Their goal was not primarily territorial conquest, but to bleed the French army white by forcing it to defend a position of immense symbolic importance. The Battle of Verdun quickly became one of the longest and most brutal engagements of the war. French casualties mounted at an alarming rate, and by the spring, it was clear that France needed relief. It was in this context that the Battle of the Somme was conceived. Originally planned as a joint Anglo-French offensive, the Somme attack was intended to break the German lines and restore mobility to the Western Front. The chosen battlefield lay along the River Somme in Picardy, an area where the British and French armies met. The terrain consisted of gently rolling hills, open farmland, and small villages, offering few natural obstacles but excellent fields of fire for defenders. As the battle planning progressed, the situation at Verdun forced a change in priorities. The French army, heavily committed to defending Verdun, could no longer provide the bulk of the attacking force. As a result, the responsibility for the Somme offensive fell increasingly on the British Army. For Britain, this would be the largest military operation it had ever undertaken. At the head of the British Expeditionary Force was General Sir Douglas Haig, appointed Commander-in-Chief in December 1915. Haig believed that a decisive breakthrough was possible if sufficient force and determination were applied. He also believed that the Somme offensive could serve multiple purposes at once, relieving pressure on the French at Verdun, inflicting heavy casualties on the German army, and potentially achieving a breakthrough that could end the war. The British army that prepared for the Somme was very different from the small professional force that had crossed the Channel in 1914. Heavy losses in the early years of the war had necessitated mass recruitment. Lord Kitchener's call for volunteers had brought hundreds of thousands of men into the army, many of whom enlisted alongside friends, family members, and co-workers in what became known as PALS battalions. These men trained together, lived together, and would fight together on the Somme. Training, however, was often rushed and uneven. Many units had only been formed in late 1914 or 1915 and had limited experience of modern warfare. While some officers and non-commissioned officers were veterans, many were learning on the job. Despite these challenges, morale was generally high. Soldiers believed in the necessity of the offensive and trusted their leaders' assurances that the massive artillery bombardment plan for the Somme would crush German defenses. The plan for the battle called for an unprecedented preliminary bombardment. Beginning on June 24, 1916, British and French artillery would fire continuously for 7 days. The objective was to destroy German barbed wire, collapse their trenches, and kill or demoralize the defenders. By the time the infantry advanced, it was believed that little resistance would remain. In total, more than 1.5 million shells were fired during the bombardment. The noise was constant, a deep, rolling thunder that could be heard miles away. Soldiers waiting in the trenches took comfort in the belief that nothing could survive such punishment. Some officers even described the coming advance as little more than a walk. But the reality was very different. Many of the shells were poorly manufactured and failed to explode. Others were shrapnel shells, designed to kill exposed troops but largely ineffective against deep dugouts. The Germans, anticipating such bombardments, had constructed extensive underground shelters, some more than 30 feet deep. When the shelling began, German troops simply went underground and waited. Meanwhile, the bombardment churned the battlefield into a moonscape of craters and mud. Instead of clearing paths for the attackers, it often made movement more difficult. In some areas, the wire remained largely intact. In others, it was tangled into even more formidable obstacles. As the bombardment continued, German commanders quickly realized that a major offensive was imminent. They reinforced threatened sectors and prepared their machine gun crews. By the end of June, the German defenders were ready. On the night of June 30, British soldiers were issued final orders. Many wrote letters home. Some prayed. Others tried to sleep in the cramped trenches, surrounded by the smell of damp earth and cordite. At 7:28 on the morning of July 1, 2 massive mines exploded beneath the German lines, one at Hawthorne Ridge and another nearby. The ground shook violently, sending columns of earth and debris into the air. 2 minutes later, the artillery fell silent. At 7:30, whistles blew along the British lines. Ladders were raised, and men began to climb out of the trenches. Carrying heavy packs and equipment, they advanced in long, evenly spaced lines, just as they had been trained. Almost immediately, German machine guns opened fire. From fortified positions overlooking no man's land, German gunners poured bullets into the advancing waves. Men fell by the hundreds. In many sectors, the attackers never reached the German wire. In others, small groups managed to penetrate the first trench line, only to be cut off and overwhelmed. The scale of the losses was staggering. Entire battalions were wiped out in minutes. In some PALS units, more than half the men became casualties on the first day. Messages from the front painted a grim picture of chaos and slaughter. Stretcher bearers struggled to keep up as the wounded lay crying out in shell holes and tangled wire. By nightfall on July 1, the British Army had suffered approximately 57,000 casualties, including more than 19,000 dead. It was the worst day in its history. And yet, the battle was not over. In fact, it had only just begun. Despite the catastrophe of the first day, the offensive continued. Haig and his senior commanders believed that the German army had been badly shaken and that perseverance would bring success. Over the following weeks, the fighting settled into a grim pattern of localized attacks, counterattacks, and relentless artillery fire. The French, operating on the southern sector of the Somme, achieved greater success. Their artillery was more accurate, and their tactics more refined. They captured several objectives and advanced steadily, inflicting heavy losses on the Germans. However, their gains were limited, and the overall strategic situation remained largely unchanged. As July turned into August, the battlefield became a place of unimaginable suffering. Heat, flies, and the stench of decomposing bodies added to the misery. Rain turned shell holes into water-filled graves. Trench foot, dysentery, and exhaustion took their toll on soldiers on all sides. New weapons made their appearance. Flamethrowers, trench mortars, and heavy artillery were used in ever greater numbers. Airplanes dueled overhead, observing enemy positions and directing fire. The war was becoming increasingly industrialized, with men serving as components in a vast, deadly machine. In September, the British introduced a weapon that would change warfare forever. On September 15, 1916, tanks were used for the first time in battle during an attack near Flers-Courcelette. These early tanks were slow, unreliable, and mechanically fragile, but their psychological impact was immense. German soldiers, unfamiliar with such machines, were shocked to see armored vehicles crawling across the battlefield. Despite some local successes, the tanks were too few in number to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Many broke down before reaching the front lines. Others became stuck in mud or were knocked out by artillery. The promise of armored warfare was clear, but its potential would not be fully realized until later in the war. As autumn set in, the fighting dragged on. Rain turned the Somme battlefield into a sea of mud. Movement became almost impossible. Men slipped, drowned in shell holes, or froze in the cold. Attacks continued, but gains were measured in yards, not miles. By November, it was clear that the battle had run its course. On November 18, 1916, the final British attack was launched along the Ancre River. Limited gains were made, but the onset of winter brought major operations to an end. When the Battle of the Somme officially concluded, the numbers told a grim story. British casualties totaled approximately 420,000. French casualties were around 200,000. German casualties are estimated between 400 and 500,000. Together, the total approached 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing. In terms of territory, the Allies had advanced only about 6 miles at their deepest point. The German army remained intact and capable of fighting. The strategic breakthrough Haig had hoped for never came. And yet, the battle was not without consequences. The Somme inflicted enormous losses on the German army, contributing to its gradual weakening. It forced changes in tactics, accelerated the development of new weapons, and shaped the future conduct of the war. For the soldiers who fought there, it became a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the horrifying cost of modern warfare. The fields along the Somme would never be the same again. As the battle moved beyond its opening weeks, the character of the fighting on the Somme became even more relentless. The shock of July 1 had not ended the offensive. Instead, it hardened the resolve of commanders on all sides. For the British leadership, calling off the attack after such losses was unthinkable. Too much had already been sacrificed, and the belief persisted that the German army was close to breaking. For the soldiers in the trenches, however, the reality was a grinding cycle of attack, defense, and survival that seemed to offer no escape. Throughout July and August of 1916, the British Army launched a series of smaller, piecemeal assaults along the Somme front. Places like Mametz Wood, Contalmaison, Pozières, and Delville would become names etched into memory through bloodshed. These were not large sweeping offensives, but brutal struggles for limited objectives, often no more than a few hundred yards of shattered ground. Mametz Wood, attacked in early July by the 38th Welsh Division, became a scene of particularly savage fighting. Dense undergrowth concealed German machine gun positions, and progress was slow and costly. Men advanced through splintered trees and tangled roots while shells burst overhead. By the time the wood was secured, casualties were heavy, but the psychological cost was even greater. Soldiers spoke of the eerie silence that followed the fighting, broken only by the cries of the wounded. Further north, Pozieres Ridge became one of the most fiercely contested areas of the entire battle. The ridge offered commanding views of the surrounding battlefield, making it a key strategic objective. Australian divisions, fighting under British command, were tasked with capturing and holding it. Over several weeks in late July and early August, the Australians endured constant shelling that one observer later described as the most intense bombardment experienced by any troops during the war. The ground around Pozieres was pulverized so thoroughly that landmarks disappeared. Trenches collapsed as soon as they were dug. Men lived in shallow scrapes, exposed to artillery fire day and night. Casualties mounted rapidly, and relief units often suffered just as badly as those they replaced. By the time the fighting moved on, the Australian divisions had suffered tens of thousands of casualties, a profound loss for a nation with a relatively small population. Delville Wood, near the village of Longueville, became another symbol of endurance and sacrifice. South African troops were ordered to hold the wood at all costs after capturing it in mid-July. For 6 days, they endured relentless German counterattacks and artillery fire. Trees were stripped bare, reduced to blackened stumps. By the time relief arrived, only a fraction of the original defenders were still standing. The wood remained in Allied hands, but at an enormous human price. Throughout this period, the French army continued its own operations on the southern sector of the Somme. While often overshadowed in popular memory by British losses, the French played a crucial role in the battle. Their artillery coordination and infantry tactics were generally more effective, the result of hard lessons learned earlier in the war. French forces captured several key positions and advanced more steadily than their British counterparts, though they too suffered heavy casualties. The German response to the Somme offensive evolved over time. Initially relying on rigid defense of forward trenches, German commanders gradually adopted a more flexible approach. This included allowing attackers to take lightly held front lines, only to be met by fierce counterattacks from reserves positioned further back. This defensive depth made it even harder for the Allies to achieve lasting breakthroughs. German soldiers, like their opponents, endured horrific conditions. Continuous shelling caused physical and psychological trauma. The fear of sudden death was constant. Many German units were rotated frequently in and out of the line to prevent collapse, but the strain was enormous. Letters and diaries from German soldiers reveal a growing sense of exhaustion and despair, even as they continued to fight with discipline and determination. By late August, the Battle of the Somme had become a war of endurance rather than maneuver. The original hopes of a rapid breakthrough had faded, replaced by the grim objective of wearing down the enemy. General Haig increasingly framed the battle as a necessary process of attrition. If German losses could be sustained at a high enough level, eventual victory might still be achieved. This logic, however, came at a terrible cost to the men carrying out the fighting. Replacements arrived at the front often with minimal training, stepping into a landscape of destruction that bore little resemblance to anything they had known. Many were killed or wounded within days, sometimes within hours. The sense of futility grew, but discipline held. As September approached, the British command sought new ways to break the deadlock. Improvements in artillery techniques allowed for more accurate and coordinated barrages. The creeping barrage, where artillery fire advanced in stages ahead of the infantry, became more refined. This offered some protection to attacking troops, though timing errors could be disastrous. It was against this backdrop that the decision was made to deploy a new and untested weapon. The tank, officially known as the landship during its development, had been designed to cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and support infantry advances. Though still experimental, it offered a glimmer of hope for overcoming the stalemate. On September 15, during the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, 49 tanks were committed to the attack. Only 32 reached their starting positions, and fewer still functioned as intended. Those that did move forward caused panic among some German defenders, who had never seen such machines. In a few areas, tanks helped infantry capture objectives that had resisted previous attacks. Yet the limitations of the early tanks were quickly exposed. Mechanical failures were common. Some vehicles became stuck in shell holes or broke down under fire. Their slow speed made them vulnerable targets once the initial surprise wore off. While the attack achieved some localized successes, it did not produce the decisive breakthrough that had been hoped for. Nevertheless, the introduction of the tank marked a turning point in military history. It demonstrated the potential of armored warfare and hinted at future developments that would eventually transform the battlefield. On the Somme, however, it was still the infantry who bore the brunt of the fighting. As autumn deepened, weather conditions worsened dramatically. Heavy rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire. Roads became impassable. Horses and men alike struggled through knee-deep mud. Artillery pieces sank into the ground, making accurate fire more difficult. Supply lines faltered, and the wounded often waited hours or days for evacuation. The psychological toll of the battle became increasingly evident. What would later be recognized as shell shock afflicted thousands of soldiers. Men experienced trembling, paralysis, nightmares, and an inability to function under fire. At the time, understanding of such conditions was limited, and sufferers were often stigmatized or accused of cowardice. Nevertheless, the sheer scale of the problem forced military authorities to acknowledge that the strain of modern warfare could break even the strongest individuals. Despite everything, the fighting continued into October and November. The final major phase of the battle focused on the area north of the River Anchor. On November 13, British forces launched a surprise attack in freezing conditions, achieving some success against German positions. Beaumont-Hamel, a village that had resisted capture since July 1, finally fell. The last major assault came on November 18. It was a limited operation, reflecting both exhaustion and the onset of winter. After this, large-scale fighting on the Somme ceased. The armies settled into defensive positions, preparing to endure another cold season in the trenches. When the guns finally fell silent, the scale of the devastation became clear. The landscape had been utterly transformed. Villages had been reduced to rubble. Forests were gone. Fields were cratered beyond recognition. The human cost was almost impossible to comprehend. The Battle of the Somme did not deliver a decisive victory for either side. The front line had moved only a few miles. Yet the consequences of the battle extended far beyond the ground gained or lost. The German army had suffered irreplaceable losses, particularly among its experienced soldiers. For Britain, the Somme marked a painful but significant step in the transformation of its army into a hardened fighting force capable of sustained large-scale operations. The memory of the Somme would haunt a generation. For those who survived, it became a defining experience, shaping their views of war, leadership, and sacrifice. For those who did not, it became a symbol of the price paid in blood for every yard of ground. And still, the war went on. When winter settled over the Somme battlefield at the end of 1916, the war did not pause, but the Great Offensive did. Snow and freezing rain covered the shattered ground where hundreds of thousands of men had fought and fallen. Trenches filled with icy water. The wounded who had not been recovered lay where they had fallen, often buried hastily or not at all. The silence that followed the guns was heavy, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery elsewhere along the front. In the weeks after the fighting ended, commanders and politicians struggled to explain what the Battle of the Somme had achieved. Official communiques emphasized the bravery of the troops and the heavy losses inflicted on the enemy. Maps were published showing advances of several miles, shaded areas suggesting progress and momentum. But for many soldiers and civilians alike, these claims rang hollow when set against the staggering casualty figures. For Britain, the Somme represented a profound national trauma. The army that went into battle in July 1916 was largely made up of volunteers, men who had answered the call in the early years of the war with idealism and a sense of duty. Many towns and villages across Britain lost an entire generation of young men in a single day or a single week. Memorials erected after the war would bear long lists of names, often from the same streets, schools, or workplaces. The PALS battalions, once symbols of community spirit, became symbols of collective loss. When a battalion was devastated, its hometown felt the impact immediately and deeply. Newspapers carried casualty lists that stretched for pages. Black crepe appeared on doors across the country. The Somme permanently altered the relationship between British society and the war. In France, the battle was remembered differently. For the French army, already bloodied by Verdun, the Somme was both a relief and a continuation of sacrifice. French troops had performed effectively, achieving many of their objectives and demonstrating the lessons learned through 2 years of hard fighting. Yet their losses were still immense, and the war showed no sign of ending. For Germany, the Somme marked a turning point. Although the German army held its ground and avoided a catastrophic breakthrough, the cost was severe. The German defensive system, long regarded as nearly impregnable, had been strained to its limits. The losses in experienced soldiers and junior officers were particularly damaging, weakening the army's long-term effectiveness. German commanders later acknowledged that the Somme forced a fundamental reassessment of strategy. The idea of holding every inch of ground at all costs was gradually replaced by a more elastic defense, designed to trade space for time and preserve manpower. These changes would influence German tactics in the later stages of the war. The Battle of the Somme also accelerated changes in how wars were fought. Artillery became the dominant force on the battlefield, responsible for the majority of casualties. Coordination between infantry, artillery, engineers, and air reconnaissance improved steadily over the course of the battle. Though imperfect, these developments laid the groundwork for more sophisticated combined arms warfare. The tank, introduced tentatively on the Somme, would go on to play a decisive role in later conflicts. Though its early performance was limited, the concept proved sound. By 1918, massed tank formations would help break the stalemate that had defined the Western Front for so long. Air power, too, grew in importance. Aircraft on the Somme were used not only for reconnaissance but increasingly for combat and ground support. Control of the air became a critical factor in directing artillery fire and disrupting enemy movements. The skies above the Somme were the proving ground for a new dimension of warfare. Yet for all the technological and tactical lessons learned, the human experience of the Somme remained one of suffering beyond measure. Soldiers lived for months under constant threat, surrounded by death and destruction. Many carried the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Shell shock, though poorly understood at the time, affected tens of thousands of men. Some never recovered. The medical services struggled heroically but were overwhelmed by the scale of the casualties. Advances in surgery, blood transfusion, and evacuation saved many lives, but countless others were lost to wounds that would be survivable in later conflicts. Field hospitals worked around the clock, surgeons operating until exhaustion forced them to stop. After the war, the Battle of the Somme became a subject of intense debate. Some historians and critics portrayed it as a symbol of futile sacrifice, blaming incompetent leadership and outdated tactics for the slaughter. General Douglas Haig, in particular, became a controversial figure, often depicted as detached and indifferent to the suffering of his men. Others offered a more nuanced assessment. They argued that the Somme must be understood in the context of its time. Commanders were operating without the benefit of hindsight, facing an enemy entrenched in formidable defenses. Alternatives were limited. To do nothing would have allowed Germany to concentrate its forces elsewhere, potentially winning the war. From this perspective, the Somme was a costly but necessary step in the long process of wearing down the German army. It forced Germany to commit reserves, weakened its capacity to sustain prolonged warfare, and contributed to the eventual Allied victory in 1918. The truth, as with most historical judgments, lies somewhere between these extremes. What cannot be denied is the courage of the men who fought there. Soldiers advanced into fire not because they were ignorant of the danger, but because duty, discipline, and loyalty to their comrades compelled them forward. Acts of bravery occurred daily, often unnoticed beyond the immediate circle of those involved. Many individual stories from the Somme illustrate the human dimension of the battle. Men carried wounded comrades under fire, held isolated positions against overwhelming odds, and continued fighting despite exhaustion and fear. These stories, recorded in letters, diaries, and memoirs, provide a counterpoint to the abstract statistics of casualties and objectives. In the years after the war, the Somme landscape slowly healed. Fields were cleared of debris and returned to agriculture. Villages were rebuilt. But the scars remained. Unexploded shells continued to surface for decades, a phenomenon known as the Iron Harvest. Even today, farmers in the region still uncover remnants of the battle. Cemeteries and memorials now dot the Somme countryside. The Thiepval Memorial to the missing bears the names of more than 72,000 British and South African soldiers who have no known grave. Rows of white headstones mark the final resting places of the dead, each one a reminder of an individual life cut short. Every year, visitors from around the world walk these fields, tracing the lines of former trenches and standing where soldiers once waited for the whistle to blow. The silence they encounter is a powerful contrast to the thunder that once shook the earth. The Battle of the Somme stands today as one of the most enduring symbols of the First World War. It represents the scale of industrialized warfare, the limits of human endurance, and the tragic cost of strategic decisions made under immense pressure. It challenges simple narratives of heroism or futility, demanding instead a deeper understanding of how wars are fought and why they exact such a terrible price. In the end, the Somme was not just a battle. It was a turning point in modern history, a moment when the old world collided with the realities of mechanized war. Its legacy shaped military doctrine, national memory, and collective understanding of conflict. Above all, it stands as a testament to the men who fought and died there, remembered not as numbers in a ledger, but as human beings caught in the vast machinery of war. Their sacrifice continues to echo across the quiet fields of northern France, long after the guns have fallen silent. And that is the enduring story of the Battle of the Somme.